Hi, everyone. Welcome to Movie Macro number 8. We're going to be discussing two films, actually, one for the public and one for the patrons. We're going to start with Boogie Nights, 1997 film by Paul Thomas Anderson. And we're going to transition to, I never actually thought of this connection until Keith mentioned it because I had never seen Boogie Nights up until recently. We're going to discuss Nashville, and it is one of my favorites. I actually, for the last 5-6 years, I've been watching it pretty much on every 4th of July. So, and it's unbelievably fast to me. I mean, it's one of those films that it's 3 hours long, first of all, almost, with a ton of music in between that, feels like a 90-minute movie. And so I would say, first of all, just to tease Nashville a little bit, the connection is in the fact that they're both about as long. To me, Nashville goes a lot faster than Boogie Nights, and music is fairly central. So, do you want to start us off with Boogie Nights? Because you have a longer history with it. You said that you first saw it as a teenager. I only saw it actually first time in the last 2 weeks or so. So we'll have slightly different approaches going forward.
It was 96, right? Or 97. Yeah, so I first saw Boogie Nights when I was a teenager, probably, or I might have been 20, but probably somewhere in the range of 18 to 20. I went through a phase in college where I didn't have a lot of friends, so I would watch 4 or 5 movies a night because I had nothing better to do, really. Boogie Nights is the second movie from Paul Thomas Anderson, contemporary American film director, and it is, I would say, his best movie. It's been a while since I've seen his debut movie, Hard 8. I remember that being pretty good as well, and mostly shorn of some of the excesses that he would come to embrace in much of his later work. When he first came on the scene, he was sort of understood by a lot of film critics and film appreciators as being sort of a new Robert Altman. This movie and then the subsequent movie Magnolia, they both featured these large casts and these numerous overlapping, happening simultaneously stories. And he had a suite of actors that he would sort of rotate in and out of his films. Julianne Moore is in this one and Magnolia. Philip Seymour Hoffman is in all of his first 4 movies, and then he was in The Master as well after his biggest, most acclaimed movie, There Will Be Blood, which is not as good as this, not even close. There was John C. Reilly was in the first 3 movies, and Robert Altman was notorious as well for having sort of a stable of people like Elliot Gould, for example, that just sort of pop in and out of his work. And it's interesting because a lot of the movie brat types from the 90s, they more tended to gravitate towards Stanley Kubrick, for example, or Quentin Tarantino was really into A, Scorsese, B, French New Wave, and C, genre movies, pulp, crap, stuff like that he really loved and that he had a great passion for. Bringing back Robert Altman, especially when Robert Altman was still alive at the time, too. Shortcuts came out not too long before this. It's interesting to see someone that was at the time a younger person see that kind of movie and be like, I want to be the new standard bearer for that. I want to carry that torch. But the thing that he doesn't quite get is that Robert Altman, whatever else you want to say about him, he has some great movies and he's got some stinkers in his oeuvre as well. But the one thing you could say about Robert Altman is he was a grown-up. He made movies about grown-up things and about mostly grown-up people, that were dealing with adult problems. Whereas Boogie Nights is in a tradition of Paul Thomas Anderson that was especially prominent in his earlier movies. I haven't seen all of his most recent movies, but I know The Master has this, Phantom Thread has a little bit of this, is the mommy issues and the daddy issues. There is just a lot of scenes in his movies of people having these breakdowns about their parents or about a parental figure that has entered their life as an adult or whatever. And there's nothing intrinsically wrong with that, except when it comes again and again, it's less like an artistic choice that you're making to emphasize something about a particular character or the Arrested Development, and more advertising something about your own personal Arrested Development. And it's not his fault that so much of culture since then has come to revolve around trauma and around unresolved parental issues and abandonment issues and things like that. But it's not to his credit that he was on the bleeding edge of something that became a cliche and an insufferable one at that in so much of contemporary art and society. And that is definitely operant in Boogie Nights. It goes on the back burner at certain points, but and it makes sense in Boogie Nights because these are people that are not that intelligent, and in fact, most of them are quite stupid, who don't have a lot of other prospects. So the idea that they might be emotionally arrested in addition to intellectually and personally arrested is not a wrong choice for the movie, but it just does not. It's not manifested in a way where the director seems to be commenting on it with, a sort of like greater wisdom or a greater contextualization. It's like the director himself is a little bit lost in this, is a little bit like almost like, it's art as therapy, trying to work it out on the screen or whatever, trying to have people, break down in tears and have these really histrionic wailing monologues where they just, like at one point Philip Seymour Hoffman is just going, I'm an idiot, I'm a fucking idiot, breaking down on camera. It's like, but to go back to what I was originally saying, I originally saw this in like that 18 to 20 range, and I remember being very impressed by it at the time, and I think that's why, because in a sense, like Paul Thomas Anderson's early stuff, you could characterize, even though it's about like very mature themes, as being basically like, if there's a range between like adult fiction and young adult fiction, he occupies that niche, kind of like young real adult fiction, I guess. He makes stuff that is appealing to somebody that has like an adolescent or just barely out of adolescence sensibility, and he really makes movies in that way too, because a lot of his stuff, the thing that makes this movie interesting is that there is an exuberance, there's an enthusiasm, there's all kinds of references to different directors that he admires in the camera work and the editing and things like that. There's Scorsese here, there's Kubrick there, there's this, there's that, but it doesn't really come across as somebody that's like in control of their art and in control of their emotions. It comes across as exuberance in all of its good and its bad dimensions.
If you're somebody, in your either early 20s or perhaps a teenager, you probably would watch the movie and you would find like tons and tons of depth. But over time, like if you sort of acclimate yourself to other works, especially if you're, like spending time with writing, right, with novels and poetry, that sort of thing, you'll probably see some weaknesses. Like, so for example, to me, it's not even so much that, here's a guy that is repeatedly, meaning the director, is repeatedly either like telling on himself biographically by way of the art or however you want to phrase it. Because, like Woody Allen does the same thing in many ways, right? There's definitely something about maybe his attraction to certain types of women, I guess, until he met Suni, because she was, it seems like, very different from anybody else that he dated. But characters in his movies that are just attracted to femme fatale types or just like the wrong kind of relationships, immature relationships, he does that again and again and again. But it doesn't really seem to me a problem, because even if he retreads similar territory, he often does it in a new way. And it's just like very well crafted. Here, for instance, like early on when Dirk Diggler gets his big break and he's about to become essentially a famous porn star, when he has that argument with his mom, I remember because me watching it for the first time now as a 35-year-old, I was like, all right, this is so needlessly Oedipal, right? And especially like when he sort of like slams her against the wall, and her response is both shock, but there's also something like somewhat sexual about her shock. If you have other frames of reference, you would know that it's a little bit over the top and just too obvious. So there's problems like that going on. Overall, though, I would say that it's a good movie.
Mm-hmm.
There's definitely, a couple of scenes that are probably even like, excellent scenes, very well crafted. It wouldn't surprise me if this is honestly his best film. I remember a couple of years ago when Mark McGill on automaticnation.com wrote a review of Magnolia, and I hadn't seen the movie before, so I watched it. I was very unimpressed. It was definitely worse than this one. But I mean, there's enough here, right, that you could do a movie macro about this kind of thing, right? Like there's enough substance here to discuss it, but there's also enough faults that especially like if you are really into the film, I can imagine somebody watching this being in their teenage or 20s, and perhaps this video is specifically directed to you guys, right, letting you know that okay, there's nothing wrong with your attraction to the film. There's enough good material within it that would justify that. Like, it's not just all you, but you need to see how other people handle similar material. And when we discuss Nashville, it's like one thing that fascinates me about that movie is it's almost 3 hours long, but it's so incredibly dense. Where, like, first of all, like when you watch the film, like you always like I would recommend if you're watching Nashville, put on captions, because there's so many things going on in the dialogue, so many little pieces that you'll miss. Like every scene is just so dense, and it's leading up to something grander. That's not necessarily the case with Boogie Nights, right? There's a lot more fat there. There's characters like you can understand why they exist. That Bill character who has either a porn star wife or just a wife that's constantly cheating on him. First it's kind of like somewhat like of a joke. Here's this nerdy looking guy who happens to be, doing some sort of like what is his, something like sound type work or whatever it is for these movies, and yet his wife is constantly cheating on him. He's not actually able to like bed anyone. And first it starts off as a mildly amusing joke, but then it happens a second time, and then a third time when he just kind of goes in the car, gets a gun, and then kills his wife, her lover, and then himself. And I mean, first of all, it's kind of like it's a very thin character. It doesn't have enough going on. It's not very well written. And it's almost as if Anderson is trying to find a way to he's killing him off, right? Doesn't know what to do with him, kills him off, and the killing off process also is something that you see it coming, kind of like when he completely doesn't know what to say at this point. Usually he's like distracted and he's like complaining about it, but this time he just goes to his car. It's like, all right, he's gonna get some kind of weapon. At first I thought he was like getting pills to like kill himself, but then he gets a gun and goes on this rampage. You see it coming from a mile away, and that is a problem artistically. It's not even so much that you could have a character going through X, Y, and Z. Like none of that actually matters, right? It doesn't matter that Woody Allen is just sort of putting his own neuroses for everybody to see. Like that, it's bullshit. I mean, who cares if you do it well? There's enough, elements like this where it's like Anderson didn't quite know what to do. Maybe he was too young. Maybe there was something else going on. Because like with Woody Allen, right, he only really starts making movies that we have access to at least now. Like I believe he was 35 when he made his first movie, 34, 35. So old enough where he has enough experience with literature and with writing, for film and whatnot. But yeah, there's definitely a feeling here that's. This is something that's it's a film, there's like this YA, like a young adult quality to it.
We've kind of been bad hosts here. We should perhaps just quickly give context for the movie, like what it's about, if somebody wants to watch the discussion and see if they'd be interested in the movie. The movie is about a young man whose real name is Eddie. It takes place in the 1970s in the Los Angeles Valley, right? Or in the Valley, I guess, as they say there. And Eddie is a young guy who's like a dishwasher, busboy, things like that at a bar. He's 17 at the start of the movie, and this is a bar pretty far away from his house, but it's like very glamorous in a way that he goes far from his house to be there to sort of bask in it. And one of the glamorous things there is that it's a place where this troupe of pornographers goes to party at the end of the day. And the man who is the director and sort of the leader of the troupe, Jack, who's played by Burt Reynolds, and he's excellent in this movie, I have to say. He is both the kind of the emotional heart of the movie and also the only character that has like maybe a little bit of not quite depth to him exactly, but he at least recognizes like that this is a bullshit thing that they're all doing, and he wants to go beyond it, even if just to, you know, prove something to himself or escape something about himself or whatever.
But he's still delusional in that regard. I mean,
Yes.
when he makes like that movie where it's like Dirk Diggler is playing some sort of like, you know, special agent type guy, he's like, this is a great fucking film. It's a real movie. And he's like very adamant about that.
No, that's the sort of dark irony of the whole thing is that, I mean, if you were to explain what the plot of this movie is to somebody, you could say it's about a pornography director who finds a young man with a massive cock who has a certain like sexual magnetism to him that makes him a great fit for pornography, to be like one of the rare guys that stands out as like a porn star instead of just a guy who's in porn, you know, and who comes to believe that he can make pornography that has like actual artistic value that keeps people in the seats after they have come in the porno theater. Because remember, this was an era where pornography theaters were like a public thing that you went to instead of something that you watched on your computer in your dorm room or whatever. And he builds this kid up. He listens to some of his ideas. He starts making this sort of parodic spy / cop thriller that it is the young man Eddie's, who then goes by Dirk Diggler's idea, and they sort of have a falling out. And the shooting that happens, the murder suicide that happens, that is sort of one of the reasons that scene is so bad is because it is like a thunderously on the nose bit of symbolism, because it happens right as the 10-1 countdown to the start of the 1980s is happening at a party at the house of Jack, the pornography director. So it's like, oh no, the curtain is coming down on this little world that they have made for themselves. And it's like, I mean, the idea that like there is something wrong about the idea that there was some sort of fall of pornography in the 1980s. Like, it works as a literary or poetic license in this movie, but the 1980s was, like pornography was pretty much equally seedy at any period that it was done, like it was always publicly shamed, always publicly frowned upon. So the idea that because it transitioned from film to video, it was like there was some sort of decline that happened to it, the heart went out of it or whatever. That's a little bit ridiculous. It's not that's not something you can justify historically, but of course that's not what the movie is really about. It's using the pornography industry as a sort of parallel for the film industry as a whole, for the fall of film after the 1980s, after the 1970s era of New Hollywood and the arrival of the Spielbergs and the George Lucases and the Robert Zemeckis and other people that helped drive it down to a lowest common denominator. Anyway, after the murder-suicide and the oncoming of the 1980s, Jack attempts to resist the oncoming rush of video. He wants to continue shooting on film. But him and Dirk Diggler, Mark Wahlberg in the movie, have a falling out because Dirk Diggler comes to believe that he is like a star and special irrespective of his pornography pursuits, which he clearly is not. Like, the film goes through pains to show you that he is a painfully mediocre person in basically every other respect other than sexually. And so his life goes down the toilet, his money dries up, he starts selling drugs. And Jack, meanwhile, losing his big star, and then the money man who had agreed to keep shooting on film even though the industry was transitioning to video, gets arrested for A, causing a young 15-year-old girl to overdose on drugs, and B, for having a bunch of child pornography in his house. They don't say that explicitly, but that's what's implied by the movie. He is forced to go to video and to start making these, worse kind of exploitative, somewhat violent movies. And their lives both go down the tubes until they come back together. And their little quasi family that they have all sort of created together. It's not what it was, but they're all back together and they have each other now, and at least there's that. So that's the basic plot of the movie, and there's nothing like explicitly wrong with that, other than, like I said, the sort of historical ridiculousness of the idea of the 1980s as like the fall of some glorious era of pornography or whatever. But where the good and the bad comes from is in the details, and I'll give it back to Alex, but I have more thoughts.
Yeah, so I mean, there is something to the idea of a golden age of pornography. I'm not even talking about like artistically or anything like that, but just like being in the culture in a way where, like for instance, like I know that as like the iconic releases of the 70s and the 80s and whatnot were coming out, they did really become like cultural touchstones. They were discussed. It was both like treated with humor as well as like this unnecessary or like totally undue seriousness, because I mean it was never actually serious. Like the only thing that I like if you have like like one of these like classic releases or whatever coming out, there was like all this like build up and this momentum and like, oh, we were waiting to see like Deep Throat or like whatever it might be. And that doesn't really happen anymore, right? I think thankfully for the better, shit like pornography consumption has been relegated to, something that you do in private. Like to me, it's just crazy to me that you would go with a theater with like grown men around you and you're watching.
They're all jerking off together.
Yeah, or not even just jerking off, but just like you're just like sitting there and like meditatively watching this stuff.
It's just another community. It's just another community space that has been whittled away by the vagaries of capitalism.
Yeah, so, and like the only thing analogous to these like hyped up, pornographic releases that I can think of is, I'm not sure if you guys have been following the whole, this video on Adam 22, aka Adam 16, about a month ago, and recently him and his porn star wife decided to film something with like another male actor, which is like she has never done before. And he's like on Twitter and shit and on his podcast, he's treating this like a fucking like album release, like like July, like whatever it is, like like July whatever, like it's coming out then, and then it's like a countdown, interviews, like all this shit leading up to like essentially watch my wife get fucked. And that has never, that kind of thing doesn't really happen now, whereas like 40, 50 years ago, it might have had some resonance. And okay, so like we've been talking about all the bad things about the movie, but we did start out saying that it's actually, it is good overall. So let's maybe like talk about some of the good.
It's almost like when something has been acclaimed as much as this one has, and you see it and it doesn't live up to it, it's like kind of natural to want to just get out. Like, but what about this thing that doesn't work that you didn't talk about? What about this thing that doesn't? But like, you don't want to get caught up in the negativity either. You can start what you say. I have some thoughts.
Yeah, so like I like even so like that whole dynamic with Dirk Diggler and his mom and also his dad. When the mom is first introduced, it's Dirk's father coming up to her as she's like doing the dishes or something, and he tries to kiss her on the cheek, and she immediately in this kind of like very very kind of like annoying, naggy, harpy kind of way, says like, what are you doing? Like, don't kiss me, you're gonna burn my face. Go shave. And ironically, like he is actually shaven. Maybe like his sideburn isn't fully shaven or something, but that wouldn't be the thing that tickles her. And you see the son, and he's watching all this. He's not intently watching this, but he knows that this is that what's going on in the family. And although Dirk is like not a smart character, you could sort of tell that whatever that he doesn't understand about the world, this is maybe one outcome that he does not want for his own life, right? He's going to either like use his, big dick or like his celebrity or whatever it might be to, have a woman that I guess like respects him or something, or wants to be with him actually, and does not want to see, this thing happen in his own life. And I mean, like you see, like the father doesn't really play like a major role, but it is something that's kind of like a little bit of a ghost, right? Where it follows him a little bit, and I think that part, for instance, was well done. There's that character, Rollerblade Girl, or is that really
Roller Girl?
Yeah, Roller Girl. So. in the end, when she like comes across this guy that she went to high school with, and you have basically the director, like they're doing like an early I guess like BangBus type shit where they're just kind of like looking for guys, like random guys, to go have sex with this porn star inside of this limo or whatever it was. And she comes across somebody that she knew, and you could tell like there's this kind of like very unhealthy kind of dynamic where she feels on one hand some level of shame, but also she wants to feel respected, and that there's a nice kind of like background audio that happens. Like, so like unlike Nashville, the music here is like almost purely aesthetics. It's almost purely mood setting. There's definitely like a strong Tarantino quality here where it's like primarily style over substance.
So question about the guy that she meets, was that the guy who I didn't go back and check this, I probably should have, but was that the guy who at the beginning of the movie when she's trying to take the test and she doesn't know like any of the questions on the test, like she looks up and he's looking back at her, and because I guess she must have been like 18 and in high school when she started pornography, and her classmates are like aware of it, so he's like looking back at her and like making the blowjob motion with his mouth and making fun of her, like, and basically calling her like a slut. Was that the same guy that gets picked up in the limo, or is that a different guy?
It might have been the same guy, but if it was the same guy, I think it would be worse for the movie in the sense that it's almost as if like the way that he presents himself is, we shared, some sort of like, not necessarily like a negative moment, like in a classroom somewhere, or like, hey, we knew each other in some way. If he was like her bully or something, like it wouldn't be, it wouldn't have the same effect.
No, I disagree. I think because when I thought of it being the same guy, I was like, well, maybe like you do shit in high school that you don't remember, like he might perceive it as like, because he says that he watches those movies in the frat house.
Yeah, years do pass. I forgot about that.
Yeah, no, I mean he says he watches that in a frat house with his friends or whatever. Also crazy to me, like watching pornography with my homies. So like the idea that he's looking at her and he feels like connected to her, like, oh, we went to high, like he's being friendly with her, and if she just perceives him as like the guy who just treated her like garbage or whatever, and she clearly doesn't want to fuck him as like somebody that has any connection to her past whatsoever. I mean, if he was that guy, and maybe neither one of them remembers that he did that for all I know, but it sort of brings a resonance of this there's a part of the movie is about the delusions that people tell themselves, is the way that you elide things that you really don't want to think about or that you don't want to consider. So if he's either forgotten that he was really cruel to her, or they're both mutually choosing not to acknowledge it or whatever, and he tries to act friendly toward her, and it's only when he gets kicked out of the limo that he gets like really mad at her or whatever, and he's it's like, there's a real nice life for yourself, or you made for yourself or whatever. That there is a kind of resonance to that, I think, given the passage of years in the movie at that point.
Yeah, I forgot that. Because there is a passage of years. You don't necessarily see it, in the faces of, some of these characters, given how young they are. But I agree with the passage of years. Like it's more believable, and it still has that kind of resonance. So in terms of other good scenes or good items, I mean, like stylistically, like the music is well chosen. There's stuff that there's parts that are like well written, even if it's just kind of like jokesy, like to like emphasize how like dumb Dirk Diggler is. Like there's that kind of like early scene where he's just talking about like the shirts that he bought, and he seems to be like very like serious about it, and everybody around him doesn't even understand that this is just like a silly discussion to have. There's other characters like what is his name? Was it Bert? The stereo guy. What's his name?
Oh, Buck.
Yeah, Buck. Yeah. So there's Buck and his white girlfriend, and when they first meet, they're like, oh yeah, we were talking about sunsets, and that sunsets are good, but sunrises are better. Yeah. Like that kind of thing. Like it's a sense of like, all these are characters that they can't really see too far beyond themselves. And even, somebody like the director, who he wants to like do something that he's remembered for, but he doesn't quite understand that the specific ways he's going about doing the kinds of movies he's making, right? These are not. It's not going to be stuff that creates like any sort of like real memory for him. Even though he understands that something like he does get upset at that guy who he brings into the limo to have sex with Roller Girl, because he essentially like says something like, your movies used to be good and now they suck. But he would probably interpret it as like, I fell off, culturally, or like in terms of importance, or, not even like in terms of like artistically. So who knows exactly what's in his mind, but there is definitely that sense of like, because one thing that often happens in movies where they turn really bad is you can never quite tell where the director is in terms of like what side is he on, what does he believe about these characters, what does he think. Like, you definitely need a sense of belief and structure. Like, you have to be the guy or the girl that provides the vision, right? You can't just say the vision is going to be fully and totally provided by the audience. You're going to have to provide some of that. And you definitely can tell like where Anderson is, like on whose side. Another good quality is, I'm always interested in items like artistic objects that deal with characters, even like especially like lead characters and protagonists that are not smart. Right, because it strikes me as kind of difficult to do. It's difficult to write, like a full-length novel or full-length film on a character that is not very intelligent. Like, you need to like strategize around that. Like in Native Son, Bigger Thomas, he's not intelligent, but there's tons of strategies around that. Third person, omniscient. Sort of like trying to characterize what's going on in his head, right? You clearly can see where the narrator is, where the writer is, and here, it's a similar kind of thing. But I mean, also there's like other scenes where this kind of becomes like a little bit silly. Like I know that the movie is somewhat based on the true actual like Wonderland murders, except here it's presented differently. But even like that scene, like the way that it all fell out. The only way that I could describe it happening the way that it did is like, okay, if all these characters are just like totally just fucking stupid, okay, I could imagine it going this way. But beyond that, it's like what Dan Schneider calls, the Hollywood trope of the stupidest possible action, leads to, more and more like plot-driven details where the plot just eventually just kind of like essentially fizzles out.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's hard to say because these are, like, sometimes characters in movies aren't, like, they're dumber than the artist realizes. In this case, Paul Thomas Anderson is deeply aware of how dumb all of these people are. One of the funniest moments in the whole movie is in the hot tub in the first part of the movie. John C. Reilly as Reed Rothschild is saying, it's funny, these guys are like both basically the same guy, except Dirk has a bigger dick, so he ends up being a bigger star. They are essentially the same guy. Reed is a touch smarter and more mature than Dirk Diggler is, maybe because he got in at a slightly later age or something like that. But when he meets him, he's immediately sizing him up and he's trying to big dick him. He says that he can bench more than him. He's actually mixing drinks at the bar instead of receiving the drinks. Dirk does like a jackknife into the pool, and Reed says, "Oh, I can do it better." And he jumps into the pool. He lands flat on his back. He's in pain. But later in the scene, they're in a hot tub together. And Reed is saying, "Oh, I play music. Oh, and I wrote this poem. Here's this poem." And it's just the most, eighth, not even eighth, like a fourth grader jotting something in their notebook kind of thing. It's like, "I love you. You love me. Going down the sugar tree." It's just this total piece of like childish doggerel. But Dirk looks at him. He's still Eddie at this point. He becomes Dirk later on in the scene. And he says, "Oh, that's great." Because he's never even like thought about writing a poem or doing anything like that. That's beyond his ken completely. But there is a sense in which Reed looks at Dirk when he meets him, and he's competitive with him, but he ultimately comes to accept him and to accept playing second fiddle to him as long as he can sort of be friends and glom off of him, because Dirk has the bigger dick and therefore he is the bigger star. He has the more sexual animal magnetism, and therefore he is the bigger star. He's the lead here. But Reed can be in the driver's seat in the sense that he can, be the one that's chauffeuring him around. He can come up with all the schemes and whatnot. He's the senior partner in terms of the life that the two of them are living, I guess. And so I can't remember where we went after that, but yeah, it's and what I was going to say is, so he accepts him, but then later on, Jack, the pornography director, he brings in another young guy who is basically the new Dirk, young and boyish or whatever. And Dirk immediately becomes wildly jealous and turns into a huge prima donna. And this is partially because he has taken up a nasty cocaine habit at this point, and he is always high. And it's implied that the coke has actually given him erectile problems, because at one point he is trying to get hard for a scene and he can't. And that was one of his major value adds as a porn star, is that he had basically perfect control over his sexuality. He could get hard whenever he wanted, and he could come multiple times in a row, which is something that physiologically guys are not even supposed to be able to do. So there's almost like a mythic quality to Dirk Diggler as a character, and as a porn star as well. And that kind of goes nicely with the movie and the old Hollywood and the degenerate new Hollywood. And going on with degenerate new Hollywood, Dirk loses his job after having a fight with Jack, but it's implied that Jack has to work with this younger guy, but this younger guy doesn't really understand the sort of sensuality and the sensitivity to sexiness that Dirk has, because every time we see this guy doing scenes, it's just like, yeah, bitch, yeah, take it, oh yeah, like he's very degrading to the women when he talks to them in the scene. And that's something that is, to any guy that's ever watched porn, exceedingly common. And there is kind of a race to the bottom, going off of your Benjamin Studebaker conversation almost. There's a race to the bottom in basically all things. And that includes pornography, where it has slowly over time had to more and more play to the most base instincts of its consumers and give them like a harder and harder version of what it has to offer, because they can become desensitized to just the bare novelty of seeing people have sex on film. And so it has to get harder. You got to get more of this BDSM stuff in it, more of this degrading to women aspect of it. And yeah, that's part of the fall of the pornography industry as envisioned in this movie.
So one thing that Nashville has that this film doesn't is Nashville has like a totalizing quality to it. A totalizing poetic quality. We're going to discuss some of this in the Patreon show. But Nashville also has tons of like little character moments which, just completely define it. This is why I said to watch it specifically with captions on. And this film also, it would actually have done much better with more and more of these kinds of like character specific, like little interactions. Like, for instance, for me, like one of the most memorable parts of the film is early on when Dirk Diggler and Reed meet for the first time. I mean, there's like something so natural about it. In fact, like I thought at the beginning, before I even saw the movie, like watching it for the first time, I just figured that, this is, there's some sort of like homoerotic interaction here. Right, maybe they're going to do some sort of gay scene or whatnot, because it's not absolutely clear from the beginning that Dirk himself is fully straight, and you can't tell that Reed is fully straight. But when they're speaking to one another, right, they first begin like sort of like comparing one another, like, oh, how much do you squat, right? How much do you bench? And they were supposed to like answer at the same time, like, you go first, no, you go first. And they don't, right? There's something like almost flirty there, and it's memorable and it's funny, and it's kind of like almost shy on the part, for instance, of Dirk, right? When he's like, oh, I squat 2, right? And you don't even know what that means, right? Like, is it 200? Is it is it 2 plates? Like all these like little moments that really, like, some of the best parts of the movie are specifically these like smaller moments that really work in the context of character, especially if you have like if you have dumb characters, you need some of that to really make it work. Like in Woody Allen's film Mighty Aphrodite, a similar thing happens with the Michael Rappaport character and Mia Servino's character, where they both play dumb characters, but when they meet together on a date at a diner, the Rappaport character just sort of like delivers this little story that I guess he's thought about for so long. It's been so meaningful to him, and he's just describing this dream that he had of this like eagle or something like lifting his naked body and dropping him like in the middle of like a snowy field or something. And they're just like looking at each other afterwards, and you could tell that they both think like, wow, this is very deep and meaningful. You need more like character driven like little details for it to really work like down the road, right? Like in totality.
Yeah, there are moments like that here. I think where the movies differ is that Nashville doesn't really have a central story. There's kind of a storyline, which is the build up to this political rally in Nashville, but there's not one person that stands out as, oh, this is the main character of the movie, and everything else is sort of it's to buoy up this main story. In Nashville, he sort of goes all in on the aesthetic of this is a big cast film, and everybody just sort of flits in and out, and we're just going to see what different people are like when they interact with each other. And it really works because it commits to the bit, as the kids say sometimes. Whereas this one, it sort of has like a normal, and this was based on mockumentary that he made, I think, in high school about a porn star or something like that. That was based on John Holmes, if I'm not mistaken, Johnny Wad, who's referenced in this movie, by the way. There's a central story about a main character, and then the sort of large ensemble aspect of it is kind of tacked onto it as like decoration, kind of, or as a reference to the Robert Altman roots of it, or something like that. So, there are lots of nice moments throughout the film, and going off of what you were just saying about Mighty Aphrodite in that scene, there's a character named Buck who is another, I think, one of the pornographic actors, because he constantly says, I'm an actor, I'm an actor, I'm an actor. But it's kind of unclear exactly what his role is in all this, if he also is providing audio equipment or doing audio stuff or whatever. But at the start of the movie, his character is basically just that he's kind of lame. He is a black guy who dresses in like cowboy costumes because of the line dancing fad that had happened a few years ago, and he hasn't really caught on with the new times. He hasn't started going disco and funk and all that. He thinks cowboy's going to come back. He thinks, oh, if I just stick with it, it's going to come back. It's going to come back. And he is with a black woman who seems to hold him in a lot of contempt. His boss at one point criticizes him because he insists on using tapes of country and western music instead of funk music or soul music or rock and roll to sell stereo equipment to his customers, because he works in a stereo store as his day job. And it's clear that he doesn't really know anything about stereos other than just their names, because when he tries to talk about technical details, he has to make up he says there's like 3 or 4 extra quads in there, and he sort of mutters under his breath. He's like, but that's technical stuff. You don't really need to know about that. What you need to know about is, and he's a little bit overbearing of a salesman, but he's just kind of corny and lame. And so the woman he's with holds him in contempt, and she eventually meets a different black guy who has like pretensions to depth. He sort of tries to wax philosophically about things, and it's clear that he's also an idiot, but he's more her speed because he takes himself more self-seriously. And so I believe it's at the New Year's Eve party, Buck meets this white woman, and he has decided he's gone with, like, Rick James was not big until a few years after this, I don't think, but he's kind of gone for this Rick James, like, dreadlocks and, like, tassels coming off of every aspect of his body, like an Egyptian cowboy kind of look or something like that. And she sort of gives him permission that he doesn't have to dress like that, and he takes the wig off, and they start talking, and it's nice, but it's clear they're both very stupid. So something else happens, and it cuts back to them, and they're talking, and they get distracted. Like, what were we talking about? It's oil paintings. Wait, oil paintings. Why were we talking about oil paint? No, sunsets. Sunsets. Oh yeah, we were talking about sunsets and how sunsets are so great, but sunrises are even better than sunsets.
Yeah,
Just
and
this.
she herself is also an oil painter, right? You see like her like bad paintings.
Yeah, and it's also implied, as with many things, like she may be a porn star. I mean, she's a big-titted blonde woman who's hanging out with porn stars, so it's probably fair to assume that either she's in the industry or has been in the industry or whatever. So they end up together, and they end up I don't know if they end up getting married, but they end up having a kid together. And there's an odd scene which is both cliche and not at the same time. I'm not quite sure where I land on it. I think we talked about this beforehand, where I think it's on the way to the hospital for the delivery, actually, or she's about to be going into labor because she's very, very pregnant. And he goes into a donut shop and asks for a dozen donuts. And you sort of suspect, based on its placement in the movie, everybody else is having a bad time. He goes into the donut shop and somebody comes in to rob it, which is like already, this criminal's not any smarter than Dirk and his friends, because you're going to go rob a donut shop. Like, I mean, I guess they have a lot of cash on hand because you get small bills, but not going to be a lot of money in there for the risk you're taking. And while he is robbing the place, there's a guy sitting off in the corner. It's just this total stereotypical redneck looking guy. It's in San Francisco. I don't know why this guy's there. Or I guess the San Francisco, yeah. Oh, it's L.A. I mean, it's California. It's liberal California, but he's reading a magazine called like Hunting and Shooting, and he sees this robbery happening. And while the robber's not looking, he pulls a gun out of his pocket, and there's a little bit of glint in his eye, like, oh, finally, I've been dreaming about shooting a robber for years, and finally I get a chance to. Although he's very stoic in most of his face. And so he shoots the robber. The robber falls backwards. He shoots the guy, and then the guy kind of, and his hand stiffens up. And apparently there was a second one in the chamber because he shoots the clerk of the donut shop and kills him. And so Don Cheadle, who plays Buck, he is sitting there horrified. But then he looks down, he sees there's this bag full of way more money than I would expect a donut shop to have. They must keep a lot in the safe there. And he had earlier been denied an application to start his own stereo store to try and go straight out of the pornography business, because he's been in the pornography business, and the bank doesn't want to be in business with somebody that's been in pornography. And so then that transitions to the end of the movie, where he is where he has actually started his own record store, and I guess his corniness has kind of come around because he's in this sort of early hip hop gear, and he's got people doing bad hip hop dancing next to him while he cuts his commercial for his store and blah blah blah. But the Buck character is pretty extraneous in the movie. I would say he doesn't add a lot, but there are some nice interactions, like I said, the conversation where they sort of show how dumb they are, but they're the right kind of dumb for each other, and so they can connect on a deeper level, even though there's no depth to them as people. And the scene in the donut shop is the nice little just one-shot characterization of the guy. He's reading a hunting magazine. He has a gun. He wants to shoot somebody. And I wasn't sure how I felt about that scene, because you think something's going to go wrong, and something does, but it redounds to his benefit. So there's kind of both the cliche and the subversion all at once. And I don't know if it quite gets all the way to the subversion, but it's going for it at the very least.
Yeah, I saw this movie for the first time very recently, and as soon as I saw his wife is pregnant in the car, as soon as I saw that, I was like, damn, something bad is about to happen. And of course, like, yeah, your mind does sort of go like, maybe something bad's going to happen to her, right? We're kind of like presenting this just to, essentially have some kind of like grisly outcome. And yeah, there is a grisly outcome, but it goes in a totally different direction. So, okay, not a totally different direction, but different enough where you start wondering a little bit, all right, is this a cliche? Is this a subversion? And I think, that's objectively to the benefit of Anderson, right? He could at least say there is enough sort of ambiguity here that he's kind of like at least like thinking about what's going on. Not the final ending, we're going to get to that, but basically where everybody seems to sort of come together at the end. and it's like a kind of like Keith called like a surrogate family, and I mean these are like either pornographers or former pornographers together. One thing that immediately struck me watching it, as everybody's kind of like happily living, even like the babies there, you see like the babies are in the pool and everybody's like happy. One thing that struck me about this is like, first of all, everybody here seems like if they were like addicted to coke before, now they're not. They just look healthier, right? Their faces look healthier, and there's a kind of like, you know, irreality there in the sense that what, like, you know, you guys are essentially these rich pornographers, and you're famous or you're semi-famous. You have coke habits, and now like every one of you are suddenly better, right? Simply on account of a traumatizing event. That's like a kind of idealism that, you know, like I'm not even fully like 100% on exactly where Anderson is on this, but it does seem like he's doing a send-up of the idea of a golden age by presenting something that's a little bit, you know, outside of the bounds of ordinary reality, right? We go from 70s now into the 80s. Now it seems like it's getting close to the mid 80s at this point. That could, you know, just be a comment on, you know, just the whole idea of golden age thinking is just like totally unrealistic. Like we were, you know, mentioning earlier about the fact that, you know, whatever that you could say about the golden age of pornography, you know, it probably was not like it was just maybe more culturally important in some way. It's not that it's necessarily, you know, like, oh, it used to be art and now it's not, right? That's not what we're talking about. That's not like a realistic appraisal. So there does seem to be a kind of send up, and even you see Buck's wife, right? She's still continuing those paintings, right? Going like both like in terms of like she's doing a painting of the pool. Then we're kind of like taken through the rest of the house. You see more and more of these like bad paintings, and nobody there is like really cognizant of that fact, right? Like they're all like kind of like wannabe artists in different ways. But I think, Keith, before you were also talking about like just how bad it was that Hoffman's character was just like totally wasted. The acting was totally wasted. So maybe talk about that.
Yeah, no, Philip Seymour Hoffman was a great actor, and it's a real shame that he died of a drug overdose because he had more great performances in him, I think. But he's totally wasted in this movie. He plays this character, Scott, who the function that he serves in the movie is like, oh, here's somebody that's an unattractive guy, you know, more overweight, can't be in the movie, but he can be a production assistant. He can hold a clipboard and ferry people from room to room, keep things on schedule, that kind of stuff. But he's basically a remora on this little pocket of money and attention that these people are occupying. You know, he is a clout chaser, for lack of a better word. He's always trying to hang out with the guys, and he's trying to leech off of their coolness of being, which they're, I mean, I maybe there was more of that back in the day, but I would say being a porn star is not really thought of as cool anymore. You know, it's maybe there's some vestigial respect for the fact that you can be a guy and get on camera and fuck a woman for like hours and keep an erection and, you know, and not come for that long or whatever. But, you know, for the most part, I would say any glamour to the profession was, if there ever was such a thing, was lost a long time ago. But the thing about this character that makes it just not work and makes you wonder, because it has to have been conscious because of the people involved, like what they were thinking, is that this character is a closeted homosexual, and like the closet is covered with like to say that it's a closet, like the door is like see-through muslin. You know, he is always having these little like effeminate motions, and at one point he comes to get Dirk for his first scene, and he's got a clipboard with a pen sticking out of the top of it, and he's like sucking and chewing on the pen as he's talking to him, like compulsively. And I know that's a stereotype of like a closeted gay guy, is they find like phallic things to like play with or whatever, which I'm sure, I don't even know if that is psychologically true, but literarily it is like both a massive cliche, but also just completely over the top and unnecessary. And Hoffman was a good enough actor, and Anderson, you know, he's over the top in a lot of ways, but he certainly is smart enough to know that this like this is way too much. This is way, way, way too much. So it has to have been a conscious decision between the two of them. The only thing I thought of this after we talked about it the last time, maybe they're showing how dumb Dirk is, that somehow he doesn't know that Hoffman is gay, and he's taken aback when he tried, and that he's into him, because he's taken aback when at the New Year's Eve party Hoffman tries to kiss him and ask him if he wants him to kiss him, and he's like, no man, come back inside, like, enough, stop it. That may have been, but I mean it doesn't add whatever they thought it was adding, and it completely detracts from the movie, and it wastes what was always, but what is now in retrospect, like a finite number of Philip Seymour Hoffman's hours as an actor on this planet, on this just completely unnecessary throwaway character that makes a point that, like, Hoffman was a good enough actor, they could have made it differently and made it not so on the nose and obvious, but they were trying something, but it doesn't come through at all. The thing with the family in the beginning, it sort of, so the mother is just a total shrew, just mean, abusive, like completely unhinged, and the father says nothing, and he seems to be basically absent emotionally from his son's life. He's just completely given over to the mother's moods and rages, and she just lets her have her way in general, but especially with him. You had mentioned the funny thing is that if you look at the guy, it certainly looks like he had shaved that day. So it's like, what, it wasn't close enough for you? Like, what, he's got to use like a straight razor every time he shaves, whatever. But the whole thing with Dirk's relationship with these pornographers is it's sort of him like playing out his trauma that he's experienced with his family in like a really perverse way. That Jack is much more open and involved in his life than his own father seems to be, and seems to intercede for him in moments where his own father never would or even could have. And the Julianne Moore character, Amber Waves, she sort of sees, because she's having a custody battle with her ex-husband over her son, who the father does not want him around a bunch of pornographers. She sort of adopts Dirk as like a surrogate son, but there's the weird Oedipal aspect coming in again, because at a party that he has when he first, gets his big payday and he has a lot of money, she has sex with him on his bed after telling him like, oh, you're like my son, you can call me mom. Like, there's this weird but he doesn't ever actually seem all that interested in her as a mother character until he gets to his lowest point after he's been beaten later in the movie. He more seems to seek the approval and approbation of Jack, who is the more absent figure from his life. So it's like, I get what Anderson was going for there, but it all, like with everything else, it all plays a little bit heavy-handed, and it all plays like a precocious teen or a young 20-something dealing with something that has just happened to him, and not like a wizened person who can look at abuse as like something in your life that has context and that something came after it. He doesn't seem to have worked it out yet. He hasn't figured it out, so he's like playing it out on the screen almost. It's not like the characters are play acting it as like a theater in which they are just puppets or something like that. It's, you can like feel the hand of the artist and the therapeutic need of the artist to get this out on the screen and work it out in this way. And it's ballsy, but it just doesn't work. It doesn't transcend the art as therapy aspect of it.
You were mentioning side plots before, and you mentioned something I didn't realize, the Maggie versus Amber little side thing with the child, like trying to speak to her. Why don't you comment on that?
Oh yeah, no, that was another that's another nice character moment, is that you get the sense that these people, maybe they learn the person's real name once and then they seem to forget it, because Eddie is only Eddie to these people in the first scene. After he comes up with the name Dirk, and at the first film shoot he has to be called Dirk from then on out. Nobody ever calls him Eddie again, I don't think, at least I don't remember it. And similarly, there's a scene at the beginning where they're at a party, and the telephone rings, and there's just two guys. One of them is Maurice, played by Luis Guzman, standing around near the phone, and Luis Guzman picks up the phone and he says, Maggie. I've never heard of Maggie. Who's Maggie? There's no Maggie here. Okay, fine, I'll ask around. And he goes around the house, but he never goes to Julianne Moore's character, whose real name is actually Maggie, but everybody only knows her as Amber Waves. That's her porn name. He goes, Maggie, anybody here named Maggie? Who's Maggie? There's a phone call for you, Maggie. And he goes back, he says, oh, sorry, there's no Maggie here. Sorry, and hangs up the phone. And that was, the thing that she most desperately wants in the world is to reconnect with her son, who she's being kept away from. And that would have been to talk to her son, which her ex-husband does not allow, would have really done something for her at this point in the movie. But because nobody even knows that that's her name, nobody even thinks to ask her, or even ask her, do you know a Maggie? Is there somebody at this party named Maggie? And so she is denied that, and she does not even know about it. So that is a nice character detail.
And you need to see the movie twice, I think, to even recognize that happened. I mean, I totally forgot that until Keith brought it up.
Yeah,
this is in fact what was going on. It's an after the fact thing that it's one of those things that you put into a plot that Anderson knew it's going to have payoff, for multiple viewings.
Yeah, well, it does have payoff, but it also, I mean, the one good thing I can say is that Derek never seems super interested in Amber as a mother figure, but Roller Girl, who's another person who nobody that she is supposedly family with ever says her name. The only person who says her name is the guy in the back of the limousine that they're trying to do the Bang Bros thing with, that she went to high school with. He says, Brandy. It was Brandy, right? Everybody else just calls her Roller Girl. A roller girl. That's all anybody ever knows her, and that's presumably how she's billed, because she's always wearing roller skates in every scene in the movie, almost. And she is intensely interested in Julianne Moore as a surrogate mother figure, and Julianne Moore acquiesces and goes along with it, but she doesn't actually seem to have as much like emotional investment in Roller Girl as a surrogate child as she does in Dirk, who's the one who ends up shirking them. So that aspect of, at least, the fact that there is that Oedipal weird aspect to it, but nobody is exactly playing into it in the way that anybody else wants, and they're all sort of going unfulfilled in the way that they're using each other to fill in these like familial traumas that they are trying to overcome. That aspect of it is nice. Now the excess of the whole device in the first place is another matter, but at least there's a little bit of the subversion of the usual Oedipal tropes in that everybody is not able to get what they want out of engaging in it.
Why don't you actually talk about the ending? Because both of us agree that the final ending, meaning like, I mean, I already talked about this, the de facto family kind of
the montage set to God Only Knows by the Beach Boys.
Yeah. So like we have, for instance, like we have this sort of like family reconnection. Everything is sort of seems to be better. They're off of coke and whatnot. But the final like ending, true ending, would be the monologue that Dirk Diggler does, looking into a mirror, where we see his dick for the first time, and it's like it's almost as if like the central character of the movie, right, makes the appearance for the first time.
So the actual like ending of the movie, because basically everybody else, what it's saying is that everybody is getting into a better place in their life. Buck has opened the store. Amber seems to be transitioning out of pornography and going into small time directing and editing. Like there's a scene earlier where she makes a little faux documentary about Dirk Diggler. I don't know who the hell's going to watch a documentary about a porn star in the early 1970s, but or like where it's even going to show. But at the end, she's directing a commercial for Buck's stereo store, and she seems like she's doing a good job of it, And Jack has all his children, quote unquote, back in his house. Dirk is back in the house. I'm trying to think. Oh, Maurice. He had mentioned earlier in the movie that his family's all back in Puerto Rico, and he likes having his place, but he wants to be in the movies because he wants to have something that he can show them. And there's a nice moment where his brothers have finally come over from Puerto Rico. Like, he's made enough money from pornography to find it. It's not immigration because it is an American territory, but whatever you want to call it, them moving to California. And he's opening either a new place or rechristening his old place. And it's the Rodriguez Brothers nightclub, but they fucked up the sign and the G is a Q instead. That's hilarious. And that's good. That's like a nicely observed, like, you know, even the dream gets a little bit fucked up, but it's funny in a way that feels real and true to life. I mean, I hate talking about truth in art, but that feels true in that moment, you know, that they would fuck up the sign and put a Q on it instead of a G. But everybody else is in a better place. Oh, John C. Reilly, he decides to pursue his passion as a musician with as a magician, I mean, with a stage act. And it's really lame, like something you would see in Cosmo's bar in The Killing of a Chinese Bookie, like almost a parody of a magic show because it's so bad, but it also has elements of his pornography as well, kind of like the buxom assistant and the chintziness of the whole thing, like in the same way that pornography is always like a parody of a real movie. This is like a parody of a magic act, but everyone's kind of going along with it. And you can be bad at magic and not that impressive at it and still you know, make a living, especially in those days because it was so novel and hadn't been overexposed yet. But Dirk, you know, he's been kind of a blank slate in a lot of ways throughout the movie. You know, he goes straight from his childhood basically into this fantasia of fame and success, and he slowly has this dark descent into drug use and attempted criminality and a music career that doesn't go anywhere in a very funny scene. And so he's come back to pornography and he really seems to have no out from it. You know, he doesn't have any other discernible talents. He's not smart. Maybe he could have been a decent, like, soap opera actor if he'd pursued it, because he does get better as an actor as the movie goes on, if only because he gets more confidence. Maybe he could have put something into that, but even that probably not. You know, so the last scene is him dressed in Miami Vice clothing. You know, we moved into the 80s now, and his Brock Landers character has moved into a darker place, and I guess it has to be implied that he wrote it because they said he writes all the scripts for the Brock Landers pornographic movies. And the monologue that he is giving, like, it doesn't feel like something from a porn, and it's bad. It's like kind of it's like something from a bad movie, but it's bad in a way that almost feels poetic because there is a verging on depth. Like, he's actually seen something of how the life can be bad now, and not just like because of his parents or whatever. You know, he's actually gone through a little bit of shit. His life was in danger at one point, getting beaten by several men, and he's giving a little monologue, and it's like, oh, you know, your brain, and you want to take it out and scrub it, but you can't, and it's there's something about it that is like verging on poesy, but it is still bad, but like the fact that he's striving toward it is like the poetic act itself almost. It's not the monologue, it's like the moment. And then he stands up and he stares in the mirror, and he whips out his giant dick, and he looks in the mirror, he says, I'm a star, I'm a star, I'm a star, and he walks off. And it's the first time in the movie that you've seen the penis, and it's an impressive hog. It's a big hog. I'm not going to say it's not a nice hog, but you also look at it, it's like, that's what all this was about. You know, it's like that's what's caused all of this to happen. It's like it sort of hammers home how trivial this pursuit that they have all undertaken really was at the heart of it. You know, it was that this guy has a nice big dick and he's got a nice body, you know, and he walks out and the movie ends, and it's like this is basically all he can do, and he's gonna sit on that big dick and he's gonna ride it all the way to the ground like Slim Pickens in Doctor Strangelove until it blows up and the wheels fall off the whole thing, you know, because he really doesn't have anything else. And hopefully he gets better with money. I guess that's the only hope that you can have at the end of it.
I would say like the primary thing that makes a movie work is probably the humor, right? Yeah. Probably the humor.
Very funny movie.
maybe some, but then again, I mean, to bring this into Nashville, about to transition, with Nashville, I definitely, and maybe this is uncharacteristic, but for me, I have like tons of like actual like laugh out loud, like literally moments in Nashville. Like with the character Opal. Also, I wouldn't be surprised if Woody Allen actually took, like, if you remember Sweet and Lowdown. There's also a character there that's like this kind of like liberal, sort of like elite type, but is also just like totally, just it's like faux poetry. Like she thinks that she's deep, but she's not. But yeah, like I think the humor works especially well in Boogie Nights, and like Boogie Nights is not a bad film for art to be introduced to art, right? If you're a teenager, if you're a guy like or whatever in your early 20s. I can see that this being the kind of thing that makes you want to like explore art and understand it more, but you shouldn't, treat it as a be-all end-all, right? Like you should use it as an opportunity to expand outward. Like, because I mean, I mentioned Woody Allen several times already. He has movies that do some similar things, but he does them much better overall, right? You should really continue to like branching outward and not just to think that you found, the key to everything simply because it has like, some play with you, right, at a certain moment of youthfulness. So maybe we could use this opportunity to transition people over to the Patron show. Again, that's patreon.com/automachination. You could get not only this show, but the entire back catalog. Right, we do $5 per month. I just have one tier. In fact, it's called one tier, right? $5. Everybody's treated with equality. So maybe it's going to get a little wild. I mean, these things do get a little wild in the Patron show. Certain things should not be public. Thank you guys for watching, and patrons, will see you soon.